Very good. So I guess at a nice summer barbecue, abortion's a little bit of an intense topic. But what can we do? It's a topic that, is it's on our minds. And it needs to be on our minds, especially at Park East. We're a very engaged synagogue. And these are issues that the country is facing. And it's an issue that's divided the country my entire lifetime and continues, obviously, to divide this country. So I want to just begin, actually, briefly with a couple of Orthodox statements, reactions. Just read a little bit from them. This is page 1, source 1. So if you're lost, that's not good. Okay? Page 1, source 1. So here we have the first statement from the Aguda. Today, the Supreme Court of the United States overruled Roe v. Wade, the 1973 decision establishing a woman's constitutional right to abortion. Agudat Yisrael of America welcomes this historic development. Agudat Yisrael has long been on record as opposing Roe's legalization of abortion on demand, informed by teachings of Jewish law, that fetal life is entitled to significant protection, etc., etc. We agree with this decision. That's the thrust of this part of the statement. Again, there's a fuller statement. You could Google it. Then I brought after that the OU statement. And the OU statement is clearly, very obviously, more torn. The OU is unable to either mourn or celebrate the U.S. Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade. I mean, that is just a classic statement. When does a statement come out so conflicted? What a Jewish statement. I mean, this is like, this has to be kept. We can't be quiet. We have to speak, but we don't know what we want to say. So that's a little funny, but the truth is I'm sympathetic. I'm sympathetic with the OU because the OU says there are things about this decision Jewishly. Again, I'm going to try to bracket my own politics here, but Jewishly speaking, there are things about this decision, according to traditional Jewish sources, that are both concerning and also that are sympathetic with the Dobbs decision that overrules Roe v. Wade. Then I brought obviously there were many other statements I didn't bring from other branches of Judaism, from Reform, from Conservative, and from just independent thinkers and rabbis and spiritual leaders, women and men. And they really run the gamut. Certainly you could find many who are sympathetic with Roe and are aghast at the decision of the Supreme Court in Dobbs, limiting women's right to choose. So Jewishly, you could definitely find all sorts of sources. If we focus more on Orthodox, here's a representative of a split. Those who are supportive of overturning Roe and those who are torn. Below, I brought a recent lawsuit that was filed in Florida. And this is quite fascinating. It was filed against the state of Florida by congregation. Everybody pay attention to the name of the congregation, Ledor Vador. Okay? Now, I guess the question is, should we be joining this lawsuit? Maybe we should stand on the sidelines and see if they defeat the state of Florida and then say we were a party to that too, and then sue them for trademark infringement. That's some advice. But more seriously, Ledor Vador is a congregation in Florida that is very disturbed by the developments at the national level, the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade. And then the reason the suit focuses on Florida is because now Florida is one of the states that is going to limit abortion access for women. So what they argue over here, let's just read a little bit. In the Court of Second Circuit of the state of Florida, in Fort Leon County in Florida, the Florida legislature recently passed House Bill 5, a law that criminalizes pre-viability abortions. Note that criminalizes. Plaintiff and its members, congregants and supporters rely on Jewish law and understanding regarding abortion, which differs from the requirements of the Act. And thus, if the members, congregants, and supporters of plaintiff practice their religion, meaning Judaism, regarding decisions related to abortion, they will be penalized by the state in violation of the Constitution, meaning the state constitution. The act, meaning this proposed Florida law that's going to criminalize abortion, establishes as the law of the state of Florida a particular religious view about abortion and when life begins, meaning a Christian view, a Catholic view, which is contrary to the views of plaintiffs who are Jews, its members, congregants, and supporters, as well as many other Floridians. So that's a pretty interesting legal development. Strategically, it's also an interesting move because it's sort of playing the court off the court, because the court, while limiting abortion rights, I'm talking about the Supreme Court of the United States, has expanded free exercise of religion rights. So it's sort of trying to box in the court and say, even on your own terms, you're getting into trouble here, because by limiting abortion rights, well, that works for a lot of Catholics, or maybe other Christian groups, evangelicals, but where is it going to leave other, not just, many women who are against the decision, but also people of religious faith who have a different religious faith. And they're arguing that this will leave Jews in a compromised situation, potentially, that they can't practice their religious faith. So their argument goes. Okay, so all of that just by way of background. So what I want to try to do, it's ambitious. We have a lot of pages here. Don't get scared. Just if you're getting a little frustrated, eat a little more hot dogs, drink a beer, you'll be in a good mood. But what I want to try to do is just give a sort of an overview of certain themes and certain sources, and hopefully we'll all gain. So first, I just want to think about Roe v. Wade briefly, and then, segue into Jewish sources, how they perhaps would react and respond. Roe v. Wade, just to remind everybody here, the ruling for 1973, the very controversial, very famous, but for almost 50 years, the constitutional law of the United States until just recently, held that women have a fundamental right to have an abortion that grows out of a fundamental right of privacy. Initially, that was located in a bunch of different amendments loosely, but over time, by the time you get to Roe in 73, that was seen to grow out of the 14th Amendment due process clause that included in liberty, to not be deprived of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. There's a capital L, liberty of privacy. And privacy includes a woman's choices over fundamental matters pertaining to their body, including whether to abort a child. So that's a fundamental right. That was what Roe held. What the decision continued to say is that over the period of pregnancy, that right has to contend with compelling interests of the state. And at a certain point, as the trimesters pass, at a certain point there is a compelling interest of the state to protect and preserve future life. So basically, early abortions prior to viability are in the domain of the pregnant mother, and once a fetus is viable, then the state already can limit abortion, basically ban it, except if necessary for the safety and health and the survival of the mom. That's Roe. Roe was adjusted a bit, but overall its fundamental holding was affirmed in 1992. But now in 2022, the Supreme Court struck down Roe, reversed Roe. The part that got reversed was the idea that there is a fundamental 14th Amendment, capital L, liberty of, including liberty, a right of privacy that includes the right to have an abortion. That was reversed. So if we think about Jewish law's attitudes, or does it even have anything to react to the different things I mentioned, so let's talk briefly about actually the idea that over the course of the pregnancy, the terms, there's a difference between pre-viability and post-viability. Do Jewish sources think about that? Do they make a difference between pre-viability and post-viability? So here it's interesting that if you look in early rabbinic sources, I don't think you see this. By the time you get to Talmudic sources, the Talmud says, and I don't want you to look right now, but at some point you'll see page, I don't even know what page, source 11, but I'll just describe to you outside that for the first 40 days an embryo is not fully formed, and the Talmud uses the expression, it's like water. An embryo is like water. Okay, that is quite significant because that gives a lot of authorities, rabbinic authorities, grounds to say that for the first 40 days there's no living, even quasi-living, even embryonically formed. There is like water. That's the Talmudic expression, and that should give a lot more leniency for an abortion. Again, I want to be careful because there are some authorities who would hesitate even in the first 40 days, but based on that Talmudic statement, I think there's significant grounds to be lenient in the first 40 days. Just another important note, 40 days, how does that translate into weeks? Nowadays, we operate with weeks, and so it's not just a little under 6 weeks, it's more like 7 or 8 weeks, because the practice today among doctors, I believe, is to count from the last menstrual cycle of the pregnant woman. So that will come out to about 7 or 8 weeks. So to the extent that for the first 7 or 8 weeks, this is just conceived of halachically as water, that is significant. What about after that? Is there a difference between pre-viability, post-viability, that could live independently of the mom or not? So interestingly, this filters into later authorities, but much later. And one wonders, and some scholars have argued, that that's really a bit of an influence from the society. And that's not native to Jewish sources. That's very, very interesting. That the fundamental divide between pre-viability and post-viability is sort of absent in Jewish thinking. So then we have to ask, so what is the status of the fetus even post-viability? We'll get there soon. So that's about the issue of whether it makes a difference over time. Now, in terms of the issue of privacy, I want to say this briefly because it takes more time to explore. But overall, Judaism does have a notion of privacy. I'm talking about Rabbinic Judaism, Halachic Judaism. But not really in the sense of one has control over one's personal domain. Not in that sense. And here I just bring on the bottom of page 1 what I found helpful from Professor Suk Gerson from Harvard Law, that she just summarizes scholarship on, jurisprudence on privacy. And she says there are really two different aspects to privacy in American law, let's say. One is the idea of don't look, and the other is hands off, don't butt in. And she says these are two really different ideas. The idea of don't look is, right, don't be a snoop, don't stare into stop invading my space by the way she describes it, basically the idea of, don't look. That's good enough. Because I see her rest of her formulation gets a little more muddled. But so that Judaism does have a parallel to that. That's on page 2. The source there, just I'll say it outside from last week's parsha, that Bilam, when he blesses the Jewish tents, he blesses that they uphold privacy, and they don't snoop on one another, and they don't stare into one another. And this really is a halachic concept, that one cannot invade the privacy of another in the sense of, staring, eavesdropping, etc. That is a violation of halacha. But the idea of hands off, the idea that the law can't tell us things to do with our body, that's not really an idea found. That's a liberal idea. Maybe it's a very valued idea in our Western world, but that's not really an idea that's very grounded in halachic sources. I don't know, think about a circumcision. Right away we do things to a body without really asking. That's a command. So by and large, I would say that's more alien to Jewish tradition, the idea that privacy, meaning I am king or queen of my own domain, like my own body. Or one would have to look a lot harder to find that. More broadly, on page 2, source 4, I brought the legal theorist who is a brilliant and who died too young, Robert Cover, who I've quoted once before here in this synagogue, who says, in essence, Judaism is much more focused on duties and obligations and less concerned with rights, which is very striking when you juxtapose Judaism with Western traditions, which probably the most important starting point is, what are my unalienable rights? What are my fundamental rights? And Judaism has a dearth of sources that speak to rights, and Judaism speaks much more to obligations. Okay, let me just summarize, because I know I'm going a little fast. What we've said so far is that in terms of elements that surface in row, are there parallels in Jewish tradition? So I'll just do it in reverse order. The idea of having a fundamental right of privacy, that we don't really have much in Jewish sources about that. Jewish sources do speak about privacy, but in the sense of don't look, not in the sense of hands off, don't tell me what I can or cannot do with my body or my private domain. Obviously, Judaism also has all sorts of mores about sexuality and other things, so it does speak to the private domain. In terms of the idea that maybe there's a difference in the issue of abortion between early on in a pregnancy and late on in a pregnancy, what we said is that it's certainly not present in Jewish sources to the degree that it's a part of the discourse in the West. And in the West, that was true in the ancient West and in the modern West, and it's less present in Jewish sources. What Jewish sources do say, Talmudic sources, and this is important practically, is that the first 40 days, a fetus is just like water. That means legally. It's treated like water, and that would translate to 7 or 8 weeks having that status, which really might give a lot of grounds for an early abortion, perhaps. Okay, so the key issue that arises, I think, in Roe and also in Dobbs, not actually decided in either, but that's raised in both, is the status of a fetus. Is a fetus a life, or is a fetus not a life? And to the extent that the Florida lawsuit is saying Judaism versus versions of Christianity, it's saying Christianity, certain versions, think of a fetus as a life, define a fetus as a life, even from inception, from the very beginnings of pregnancy. It's defined as a life, while Judaism, the argument here in the lawsuit is, does not define the fetus as a life. So is that true? Is that not true? Now, just to be clear, in terms of where the Supreme Court is, Supreme Court has not taken a stand on that issue. It has not defined the fetus as a life. It said, up until, actually, sort of beneath Roe was the assumption that a fetus is not a life. In Dobbs, again, the court's not speaking directly to that issue, but it's leaving these issues ultimately to the legislator, to whether one can restrict abortion. And again, you could restrict abortion even if a fetus is not a life. You could say it's a potential life, a future life. So you don't need to define a fetus as a life to restrict abortion, but certainly allow the push for the right to life movement that's fueled by certainly certain Christian theologians, comes from the idea that a fetus is a life. So what does halacha say about this? Okay, so the goal here is to, let's see what we could find in the Bible, the most famous source in the Torah, and then let's see some other rabbinic sources, and then we'll see where we're at. So in the Torah, the most important verse on point, I'm on page 2, source 5. So if you haven't been looking, now's a good time to look, or at least to listen closely. The Torah says the following: if two people fight, v'chiyanatzu anashim v'nakfu isha hara v'yatzu yeladea v'lo ya'ason, anosh ya'anesh kasher yashit alav bal ha'isha v'natan b'flilim. So two people are fighting, and the victim in the fight is a pregnant woman. Not so clear from the text as she's sort of, well, let's go with the assumption maybe she's a bystander, but that's going to complicate things for us. So anyway, there's a fight, and the person who's hurt is a pregnant woman. Well, is she hurt? Is she not hurt? Well, we know from there are basically two cases here in the Torah. It's a classic, what's called casuistic, that's a fancy sentence for a case. And there are two cases. Case one, there's a fight and a pregnant woman is hit. And we hear that yatsu yeladeha, meaning she miscarries, but there is no ason, but there is no tragedy. Okay, there is a miscarriage, but no tragedy. So the miscarriage is not called here a tragedy, okay? Again, in modern speak, of course, if we heard something like this, we'd say, what a tragedy. So let's just realize we're dealing here with legalistic phrases. So again, there's a fight, and a pregnant woman is hit, and the result, case A, is a miscarriage, but no tragedy. So in such a case, you make just a monetary payment. Okay, there's something I could add about this, but it's going to complicate. So let's just say you make a monetary payment. I'll leave it at that. But if case B is, but if there is a tragedy, then it is a life for a life, which is the classic biblical statement of talion, which is a fancy way of saying quid pro quo, which is a fancy way of saying capital punishment. Okay? So one more time, I need everybody with me. What it says here in Shemot in Exodus is there's a fight and a pregnant woman gets injured. So case A, there's a miscarriage but no tragedy, as opposed to case B, there is a tragedy. In case A, where there's a miscarriage but no tragedy, the result is a monetary fine. In case B, where in addition to the miscarriage, or there's a miscarriage and a tragedy, let me say it that way, there's a miscarriage and a tragedy, then in such a case, capital punishment. So the key question that all interpreters have to figure out is, what does it mean no tragedy versus yes tragedy? That's a bit ambiguous in the verses. Now, maybe some of you have a sense of what the plain meaning is. In ancient interpreters, there were different understandings. There were basically two main understandings. So there's the rabbinic understanding, which a lot of scholars think is the better plain understanding of the verse. And then there is a non-rabbinic understanding, which here I've brought in through the English translation of the ancient Greek translation. So I'm on the bottom of page 2. So let's look at the rabbinic understanding that Rashi, the great medieval commentator, brings down. Case A, where there's a miscarriage and there's a monetary fine, but nothing else, there's no tragedy, meaning in terms of the mother. In other words, the result of the injury is a miscarriage, but not death of the pregnant mother. As opposed to case B, where there is a tragedy, means that in addition to the miscarriage, the pregnant mother gets killed. It's a more violent assault, and the pregnant mother gets killed. So now what's the result? If there's just a miscarriage, then there's a monetary fine. And if there's, in addition to a miscarriage, death of the pregnant mother, then capital punishment. So what can we infer from this? That if there is just a miscarriage, there's no capital punishment, meaning the killing of a fetus is not a capital offense. That would be the result. I think a pretty plain result on that reading. Now you might ask, at what point in the pregnancy did this happen? But I would answer, the verses don't care. According to the rabbinic reading and Rashi, I don't think the verses care. Now, it's not impossible to add that, but I would say that's already a bit of a fetch. It sounds like it doesn't make a difference if it's a woman who's 1 month pregnant or 8 months pregnant. That would be the result. So that would be a crucial source already, because this source would imply that a fetus is not a life. And one sort of could just intuit that early Christian exegetes, at least at some point, must have read these verses differently. Now, how did they likely read these verses? I got to be honest with you, it's actually, like everything, more complicated than you think, because they don't just read it in one way. But the most, let's just give one other way to read the verses. And I don't do this to confuse you, I just do it because it's fascinating. And here it's on the bottom of page 2, it's the Septuagint. The Septuagint says the difference between case A and case B, according to the Septuagint, all of them are focused on the fetus. The mother never dies. So what's the difference between case A? Let's read it. Now, if two men fight and strike a pregnant woman and her child comes forth, and the italics are the key additional words that are interpolated into the translation to explain things, not fully formed. Meaning, if the fight happens early on in a pregnancy, then the result is just a monetary fine. But case B is, again, it's a miscarriage, but if it is a fully formed fetus, then a life for a life. So what you have on this alternate reading is that at a certain point, a fetus is characterized as a life such that killing of a fetus is a capital punishment. Okay? Important, I want to emphasize, this is not the mainstream rabbinic reading. But this is an alternate reading in antiquity which influenced certain Christian thinkers. And that might lead to divides between pre-viability, post-viability, etc. Okay? Is everybody with me? If not, I'm not going to assume you are, so I'm going to review. What is the status of a fetus? At least here, the answer so far is, according to Exodus as read by the rabbis, a fetus is not a life. Let's turn to page 3. There's a Mishnah that seems to say this explicitly, at least in the context of certain laws. Let's read the Mishnah in Nida, top of page 3. Tinok ben yom echad, a newborn child, nochel manchil hahargo chayav, and some other things. A newborn child inherits, could bequeath, in other words, is a legal entity for estate purposes, and also if somebody, God forbid, kills a newborn child, that's capital murder. Doesn't make a difference whether a child is 1 day old or several years old or an elderly adult. It's murder halachically if you kill a person. And what's a person here? I'm adding that, but that seems to be here, at least for the purposes of murder and some other laws, a person is a newborn child. So here it seems very clear that one could infer that one is not a life for definition of murder and certain other laws prior to being newborn. So prior to being newborn, again, a fetus is not a life for purposes of various laws, including murder. So we've actually been in the context of murder, and a fetus is not a life. Again, maybe a more complex analysis might start saying, is a fetus a life for some things and not other things? That's sort of a much advanced level of analysis. We're trying to keep it simple. But at least in the areas we saw here, 2 sources that a fetus is not a life. A third rabbinic source. And this is probably the most famous rabbinic source on this topic. So that's why I put a little star next to it. This is page 3, source 7. The source tells us the following. This deals with a pregnant woman who's giving birth but is confronting significant life-threatening hardships in the birthing process or late in pregnancy. Let's read it together. Haisha shehi maksha leled. A pregnant woman who is having difficulties giving birth. At what point in the pregnancy are we? I'm asking. Question. What do you think? Late in the pregnancy, towards the end of the pregnancy, because she's on the verge of giving birth, and she's having difficulty in giving birth. And it's clear, we'll see in a second, her life's at risk. So what is the halacha? Mechatchin et hayeled b'me'eya u'motziin oto evarim mipnei shechayeya kodmin l'chayav. So the halacha is, page 3, source 7 at the star. The halacha is that even late in the pregnancy, even on the verge of giving birth, if a mother's life is at risk, then we kill the fetus. Literally cut up the fetus that's about to be born. Why? Because the mother's life takes precedent even to this late stage fetus. What about yatsarubo? What about if the birthing happened already, the newborn emerged, or most of the newborn, it didn't even fully exit? Then ein nogin bo. At that point, there's nothing to do. We cannot intervene to save the mother's life once it's a newborn, even mostly a newborn. Why? She'ein dochin nefesh mipnei nefesh, because we cannot choose between two different lives. If two lives are clashing, we cannot choose between two different lives. So this source also, if one could infer based on a simple reading, again, there are more complex readings, I'll try to touch on one or two of them, but the simple reading I think here also is that a life begins at birth. And prior to birth, even late in pregnancy, a fetus is not a life. It's not a nefesh. What's the implications here? The implications are save the mother over the fetus even late in pregnancy, even on the verge of birth. Now you might ask, and it's a fair question to ask, if a fetus is not a life, then why can we only intervene in this? It sounds like from this source, it's only to save the mom, right? The source didn't say a fetus is not a life and therefore one can abort a child. There's no source that says that, right? The sources we saw so far, we've seen 3 sources. They all say a fetus is not a life according to the rabbis. But in terms of no capital punishment, but rather a monetary fine, in terms of no capital punishment and some other laws, and in terms of a fetus is not a life if the mother's life is at risk. So what about, to have an abortion when the mother's life is not at risk? Here, the sources don't speak directly. If we build on the idea that a fetus is not a life, you would think maybe there are other grounds to terminate a pregnancy. Can one terminate a pregnancy with no grounds? Again, if a fetus is not a life, we're not sure what a fetus is according to the halacha. We'd sort of want to wonder, right? The sources don't speak clearly to the issue of abortion. They're all relevant. Does everybody see that? They're relevant in terms of a fetus is not a life. 3 sources, I think, confirm that according to the rabbis, the fetus is not a life. But that says there's no murder. So abortion, I don't think, would be murder, according to the simple reading. But maybe it would still be wrong on other grounds, not as murder, right? Even according to the Bible, you certainly pay a fine. And what about terminating a fetus's life? Well, only when the mother's life is at risk. That's what we've seen. Now, you might argue that last source, well, that's very late into, I said the lateness doesn't matter so much, but maybe here's a source that's talking about very late, even on the verge of birth, you could intervene, and you could literally cut apart the fetus to save the mother's life. But maybe earlier on, then the stakes are less, maybe the stakes get higher towards the end, but even then the fetus is not a life. Okay, I hope that didn't confuse people, but I think it's important to round things out. One last source along these lines, let's skip to page 4 on the top. Page 4 on the top might sound a little gruesome. So I don't like apologizing for the rabbis, but I sort of feel like I need to here because it sounds a little gruesome. I learned a lot about this source when I read an article of a scholar I know at Tel Aviv University who talked about how this topic was a topic discussed in the ancient world. So let's see what the topic is. Haisha sheyatza lehareg. Ein mamtinin la ad sheteled haisha ad sheteled. Haisha sheyashva lamashber mamtinin la ad sheteled. The issue is Imagine, and again, I think it's a little more theoretical for the rabbis, but this was an issue debated in the ancient world. Imagine you have a pregnant woman who's done a capital offense, and she deserves the capital punishment. And you're supposed to send her to the gallows, but she's pregnant. So the question is, should you wait until she gives birth and then send her to the gallows? Okay, again, a bit of a gruesome scenario. And here the rabbinic position is pretty shocking. The rabbinic position is you do not wait. You send her to the gallows pregnant. Okay? It's quite a shocking Mishnah, if you've never got up to this Mishnah. Yeah, and maybe there's some things to learn here. I want to suggest one thing that I learned from this scholar, because I would never have thought about this, and I thought it was very interesting. The scholar, Professor Monikdam, or something like that, I actually know her, but I forget the next name, Yifat Monikdam, or something like that. I could send you the name if it's interesting to you. She makes the following argument. She shows, I'll just say this briefly, that Roman law disagrees. And in Roman law, you actually delay the capital punishment, but on what grounds? On the grounds that the father has ownership rights over the fetus. That's the grounds. And what she argues, I think very fascinatingly, that the rabbis here are rejecting that Roman principle and saying the father has nothing to do with it. And it's all about the mother and the mother's organic connection to the fetus. Even to the extent that the fetus is so a part of the mother that this gruesome result will be the result. That's a very fascinating idea. I'm not sure, again, you have to read the article, you have to think about it, you have to look at the Roman law, but to me, there's something that resonated in that explanation. Maybe I just want to give a more positive spin on the source, but I think there's something to it. So just one more time. From this source, again, it's clear that a fetus isn't a life. If a fetus is a life, so you execute the mom, but why are you executing the fetus? Here, clearly the fetus isn't in a life. More than that, this might be the source that is the most grounds to say that we're willing actually to terminate a fetus's life. And maybe the understanding here is what the rabbis later will say, a fetus is a limb of the mother. A fetus doesn't have independent identity. A fetus isn't a life. What is a fetus? What the rabbis later will say, ubar yerach imo, a fetus is an organ of the mother. But I'm just adding, even if a fetus is an organ of the mother, maybe the father has legal rights, monetary rights. The Bible sounded that way. Comes along the scholar and says that's exactly the chidush here, that the father can't stop things. That's a very, I think, interesting point. So let me just summarize where we're at. We've seen 4 sources, and by the way, these are not obscure sources. These are readings of psukim and 3 mishnayot that all seem to imply a fetus is not a life. And the last one even leads to a surprising and maybe bit of a gruesome result, that a fetus apparently is an organ of the mother such that we don't even protect future life here. Now, are there any counter sources? So there are counter sources. I think for time's sake, I'm going to be a little bit limited here in counter sources, so let me just tell you the most famous counter source, page 4 in the middle. Page 4 in the middle is source number 9. Page 4, source number 9. And this source talks about Noahide laws. Because we know that in Rabbinic Judaism and Halakha, there's a notion not just that Jews are obligated, but that Gentiles also have a code to live by, Noahide laws. So one of the Noahide laws is, thou shalt not kill. That's one of the Noahide laws. But source 9 says included in that, in the prohibition of shfichut damim, of spilling blood, is spilling blood of a fetus. So this is the most important counter source. This source says, page 4, source 9, that if a Noahide kills a fetus, that is considered also spilling blood and is a violation of the Noahide prohibition to spill blood. Okay? Now, it's sort of an interesting question. Can we harmonize this with the other sources? That's not so easy. Obviously, later commentators had to work hard to try to figure out, is there a way to harmonize it or not? Importantly, this source speaks to Noahide. It doesn't speak to Jews. So then the question is it feasible that Noahides are banned from an abortion, but Jews aren't? That seems a little odd, and that seems to run into tension with certain rabbinic sources. And indeed, I'll just say it outside, on page 5, you have source 14 and 15, where the Tosafists are conflicted. Noahides, it's prohibited, and Jews, it's permitted? Or Noahides, it is prohibited, and Jews, it's also prohibited, but maybe it's just a rabbinic, or maybe it's a lesser form. It's not murder, because we saw all sorts of sources that sound like it's not murder. So even if you're going to say it's prohibited, and even if we'll call it spilling blood, maybe that means it's there's a reason not to kill a fetus, which makes sense, right? There's ban on killing the fetus, but it's not murder. So what is it? So here, the commentaries sort of struggle to explain what it is. Maybe it's a type of a battery, or maybe it's a rabbinic prohibition, etc. Okay, I'm looking at the, do we have it? I shouldn't ask this question. Here's the game plan. I want to skip to medieval quickly. I'm going to try to just show a debate in medieval. I hope it's not too hard to follow, and then I'll quickly talk about what happens today. So I'm going to go about, 8 to 10 more minutes. I'll try to stick to that. Page 3. I'm back to page 3. Try to just stick with me because this is interesting, so it's worth it. Page 3. Let's just remind ourselves that we have to return to source 7, and then 7a, 7b, 7c, okay? I'm going to sort of try to say this all outside, and maybe I'll read a key line inside, a key line or two. So 7, 7a, 7b, 7c, I feel like I just can't skip it because I put asterisk, meaning it's important. And I feel like malpractice if we didn't briefly talk about this. So 7, again, to refresh your memory, it's a Mishnah. And the Mishnah says if a pregnant woman, God forbid, is really struggling late in her pregnancy on the verge of giving birth and her life's at risk, then we even cut up the fetus. But once she gives birth, once the newborn emerges, the majority of the newborn emerges, you cannot save the mother because it would be picking the mother and the newborn, and you can't pick between the mother and the newborn, right? So that's what source 7 says. So so let's just unpack this source. Prior to birth, you pick the mother over even the late stage fetus. So why? So we said, I sort of stacked the decks here because I think one reading is the simpler reading. We said the reason that a pregnant woman on the verge of giving birth whose life is at risk, that you could even cut up the fetus is because even a late stage fetus is not a life. Who says that? Rashi, 7b. Rashi says, Kol zman shelo yatsa la'avir ha'olam lav nefesh hu. Or in the English, as long as the fetus does not emerge, is not considered to be a living person. So that's the Rashi. But, and this is a major but in Jewish tradition, against Rashi, evidently, is none other than Maimonides. Okay, and that's quite a heavyweight. And Maimonides seems to understand this entire source differently. I need to add 1 minute of background. The Talmud on this Mishnah says the following. The Talmud gets into, I'm sorry, this is a little intricate, but I'll explain it crystal clear, I will try. There's a law called Rodef, which is good to know anyway. The law called Rodef. Rodef means a pursuer, The simplest case of a pursuer is, sadly, in our society, these things exist. Somebody has a gun, right, and breaks into, God forbid, a public space and is about to, God forbid, shoot and kill people. That person is a rodef. And that rodef who's on the verge, a pursuer who's pursuing other people to kill them. So the halacha is you have to neutralize the rodef by any means necessary, even by killing. So if somebody has a gun, a loaded gun, and is on the verge of shooting, according to halacha, you have to neutralize the person and if necessary, kill them. The halacha says that's true even, and tragically, this is sources that are so painful to study nowadays because we could think of the scenario, even with a minor with a gun. Even with a minor who has a loaded gun and is on the verge of committing murder, you have to neutralize the minor and even kill the minor. So, in light of all of this, Maimonides now goes back to the Mishnah. It is 7c, page 37c. And he says, all of this sheds light on the Mishnah. And the Maimonides says the following explanation for the Mishnah about a pregnant woman late into pregnancy who is having severe complications and will die if we don't intervene. So Maimonides says the following. I'll read it in English. Our sages rule that when complications, bottom of page 3, when complications arise and a pregnant woman cannot give birth, it is permitted to abort the fetus in her womb, whether with a knife or with rugs. And now here the Maimonides adds an explanation, and he doesn't say what Rashi said. Rashi said a fetus is not a life. What does Maimonides says? For the fetus is considered a pursuer, a rodef, of its mother. Kerodef in the Hebrew, and that's important. In the Hebrew, the Rambam doesn't say, the English is considered a rodef, and the Hebrew kerodef. And the ke is an important, that's a conjunction, because what does that mean? Is it literally a pursuer, or is it like a pursuer? is that a metaphor? But certainly Maimonides wouldn't need to call the late-term fetus like a pursuer even, if it's not a life. Just say it's not a life. So in other words, Maimonides is saying, why do we abort the fetus, even cut up the fetus late in pregnancy? Because the fetus is as if a pursuer of the mom. What about once there's a birth? If the head of the fetus emerges, it should not be touched, because one life should not be sacrificed for another. Although the mother may die, this is the nature of the world. There are questions to ask on this, Maimonides, and it deserves a whole other shiur, and we'll get frustrated, okay? But the important point for us, and this is very important just to give a good reckoning of classical Jewish sources, is that here in medieval times comes along Maimonides and does not say what Rashi says, that a fetus is not a life, but rather says a fetus is like a rodef, like a pursuer, which seems like he's conceptualizing at least a late-stage fetus like a person, at least almost like a person, let's say. Okay, that's the more intricate stuff, and that gets us to page 6, which we'll describe outside. Page 6, outside, which we're skipping to responsa. And these are the responsa, we'll just say them outside of, I would say, not our times, but a generation before, although certainly contemporary with many of us in the room. These figures, the great Rav Moshe Feinstein Zatzal, who was, of course, probably the greatest rabbinic authority of the 20th century, certainly outside of Israel, who lived here on the Lower East Side. And on this point, his interlocutor or his spar partner, his really fierce debates with the Tzitz Eliezer, who maybe is less familiar to some people in this room, but he was a great rabbinic authority also in Israel. Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, also a great Talmid Chacham, who particularly had mastery of medical ethical issues. And he was the chief rabbinic authority, among other positions he held. He was the rabbinic authority or consultant of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital in Yerushalayim. So he got a lot of first-hand Jewish medical ethics questions. And basically, their debate actually got pretty personal, which is surprising because overall, these were not only great sages, but considered very pious and generally mild-mannered people. Sometimes rabbis, we know, do have sort of intense personalities and can debate fiercely. That wasn't their personality, but here they went at it, and even at each other, even in pretty personal ways. Rav Moshe Feinstein's position was building on that Maimonides. He thought abortion is prohibited. He thought a fetus you cannot abort a fetus's life. He basically treated a fetus like a person, despite all the sources we've gone through tonight. He was more impressed by the sources that emphasize that a fetus is a life. And he said one certainly cannot abort except in the most rare of circumstances where the mother's life is really at stake. And if one does abort, it is murder. Okay? I don't want to, without mincing words, because he said it in very blunt ways. I think today, I want to be careful here because this sort of maybe depends on your hashkafa and your perspective and who you're hanging out with. But certainly in a more modern Orthodox world, I think most people think of this as very important because it's Rav Moshe Feinstein, but more on the minority, more of a minority voice. And who am I to stick my head in? But still, I guess I will have a little chutzpah to say, at least in the classic rabbinic sources, I think there's very little to support such a stringent position in the classic rabbinic sources. Maybe Maimonides gives grounds to it, but in the earlier sources, I think it's much harder to substantiate this. Of course, Rav Moshe Feinstein knew every single source, so it's Rav Moshe Feinstein. But his position was that abortion is murder, which maybe should surprise you if you've been listening tonight, because it's not the direction that I was sort of building things up, because, again, I don't think it's the plain reading of most early sources. Countering him was various authorities, but most vocally the Tzitz Eliezer. And the Tzitz Eliezer was very explicit in rejecting Rav Moshe Feinstein. And this was unusual. The Tzitz Eliezer he was an independent rabbinic authority, but he was younger than Rav Moshe Feinstein. He usually wouldn't sort of ad hominem attack Rav Moshe Feinstein, but he thought Rav Moshe Feinstein was flat wrong on this. And the Tzitz Eliezer said that killing a fetus, abortion, is certainly not permitted, generally speaking, but at most it is, he thinks, rabbinic as a ban. It's not a Torah prohibition. It's certainly not murder. A fetus is certainly not a life. Again, we're within the Jewish tradition that, of course, takes a fetus as potential life, as something that should be preserved normally. So it's not going to be sort of a modern Western attitude that abortion at the determination of the mother. The Tzitz Eliezer would never say that, just to be clear. But the Tzitz Eliezer says that a fetus is not a person, and the prohibition of doing an abortion is rabbinic. Now, interestingly, the Tzitz Eliezer says maybe we should be more lenient early on. Certainly we could be lenient the first 40 days, the first 8 weeks, maybe the first 3 months, in certain cases even up to the 7th month. After that, he's not comfortable being lenient. And just to be clear, he says there has to be a reason to perform an abortion. It's just not a choice. There has to be a reason. His most famous tshuva talks about genetic testing, a Tay-Sachs baby. He also deals with Down syndrome and other cases when there's genetic testing and there's going to be great emotional distress and great challenge to the parents. So his position is that in such cases, one could perform an abortion. In the Tay-Sachs case, he says up to the 7th month. Interestingly, let's get to just the summary here. So we're summing up. let me sum up everything we did, and I'll just put the last part in context. So what did we do tonight? We tried to do a lot. Hopefully not too much. Take the source sheets home with you also. Obviously, afterwards, if anybody has questions, we could do some questions. That's not a problem. We talked about the reaction to the Supreme Court's recent decision, and we saw different reactions, Aguda versus the OU, and now that we've seen some sources, we get how sources cut different ways. And then we also saw, interestingly, about the lawsuit, which I think to me raises a very serious issue. How much is the recent Supreme Court decision very favorable to certain religious communities and less favorable to others? Again, there's no authority, even Rav Moshe Feinstein, who would say that one cannot do a prohibition, abortion if the mother's life is at risk. So even Rav Moshe would say if definitively the mother's life is at risk, you could do an abortion. So nobody will take the extreme version that no abortion under any circumstances. And then we saw different sources. We talked a little bit about the different phases of gestation and privacy, but the main part we talked about the status of a fetus. And just to be clear about my impression of the sources, I actually am sympathetic to some scholars who say, listen, later Jewish law got more complicated, but in the classic sources, it's pretty clear that a fetus is not a life. I happen to think that that is a fair summary of most early sources. Again, that doesn't mean one can freely choose to do an abortion, but certainly lowers the stakes. Again, the stakes might be important in a future life, certainly within a tradition that very much cares about procreation is a big deal, but it's not a life, so certainly we can't speak in terms of murder or things like that. That seems to be most sources, but not all sources. We saw one source that said clearly that Noahides cannot kill a fetus, and that is a type of spilling blood. And then we saw in medieval times there seems to be a fundamental debate between Rashi, that I think is more consistent with most sources, that a fetus is not a life, and on the other hand, no slouch, quite the opposite, the great Maimonides, who seems to say at least a late-term fetus is like a pursuer, which seems to be saying that it has some legal standing, maybe a life or maybe close to a life, at least a late-term fetus. And then we skip to the 1950s, 60s, 70s. But the truth is, I would say, this is a generalization, and I'm not master of all the literature, but I would say until Rav Moshe, my impression is that more sources were lenient. And since Rav Moshe's passing, my impression is more authorities are lenient. So it's true that you have Maimonides and you have the great Rav Moshe Feinstein who are strict, so that's a big deal. But I do think a preponderance of authorities are more lenient. And what more lenient means is that when there is a need or there's something, there's a calculus for why to abort. I don't think there's any authority who would say to be cavalier about it, but if there's a reason, then that certainly should be weighed seriously by a rabbinic authority. Again, some of the rabbis who I would turn to, I've heard them say pretty clearly that either they would allow abortion if there was a real need, certainly early on. I want to just summarize my impression of modern Orthodox authorities. Last point. Certainly early on, they would say in the first 7-8 weeks. After that, they would say if there's a need, and need does not just mean the life of the mother. It also means forms of distress, including emotional distress and other things, would be factored seriously, and they would consider doing it. Or if not, they would direct you to a great rabbi who lives today who would be willing to factor those things in. Okay, that's the basic summary. If anybody has questions, you can take some questions, comments. Thank you. If anybody needs to leave, that's also fine. Please feel free to leave. Yes? Okay. Oh, okay. You start, and then I'll get my dad. Go ahead. I'll try to repeat the question. Yeah. fantastic question. It's such a good question that I don't have an answer. The question is, this gets into the nitty-gritty of Maimonides, but it was asked, so let's just raise the question and be lame and not know how to answer it. That Maimonides says that a fetus very late in the pregnancy is like a rodef, and therefore, like a pursuer, so is pursuing the mom's life. So the question that's asked is, and once it's a newborn 2/3 of the way out, it's also pursuing the mom's life. So there Maimonides says, well, it's nature. Well, beforehand, wasn't it nature also? So why is there really a divide between pre-birth and post-birth for Maimonides? That is a question that's bothered every close reader of Maimonides, and you have to try to answer it. And the answers get more complicated. They'll say that, first of all, they'll emphasize it's like a rodef versus a rodef, and an actual rodef that's natural versus a non-natural rodef, etc. I would throw out, I'm not sure this is right, that I would say maybe something else to think about is what Maimonides talks about natural versus not natural. No, maybe it doesn't make sense. I was thinking that, I don't know. No. Yeah. Yeah, well, some people think it, but why do you think that? I actually have nothing to add, but yeah. I thought I had something, but it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
In utero,
yeah.
the fetus is not considered to be any type of person, a potential person.
Right. But why does he need that? Why does he even need to say that? Why do you even need to say he's like a pursuer then?
Well, he's setting up for what happens after birth.
But that's actually going to confuse us all. It's not helping us. I'm saying that's pretty bad expository skills, and it's the great Maimonides. I hear it. But a rodef normally should kill. That's the question.
That's why we don't.
Yeah. Okay, we have to keep arguing. This is good. Now we're in the basementers. Good. My father, yeah. My dad's asking me another question I'm going to dodge, but I'm 0 for 2 here on the questions. He asks a very important question, of course, which is what is emotional distress, and what constitutes adequate emotional distress. He refers to, imagine, which of course is reality. God forbid, a case of rape that leads to a pregnancy. I think here poskim would be very sympathetic and would say that is emotional distress. But we didn't really see in the sources exactly where emotional distress fits in. But again, I just to explain, I think the idea is if you don't treat a fetus like a life and you don't treat it like murder, then there's more room to be flexible. And certainly, I think poskim would be very sympathetic in cases of severe emotional distress. And I think a rape would cut it for, I think, almost all poskim, I would think. Yeah. In other words, mainly we're focused on the fetus and not on the mother. Is that what you're saying? But why are you saying passive participant? She's not choosing? Well, Dr. Rose is asking about the role of the mom. I'm just trying to understand, to situate the question. Right. Right. But we're not focusing. Right. 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 I hear it. Yeah, it's. I hear it. Okay, it's a strong question. So I think I sort of like, flirted with that question, but now you want me to address it head on. And I don't think I have a new source to produce. The sources that we saw, I think I said, the idea of a choice, and that's the fundamental starting point of the mom, of the woman. I don't think you have that in rabbinic sources. And the conception of it as a right, I don't think you have, and I wouldn't expect to find that. But yeah, that's true. So in cases of, I think what you do have, this is what I was alluding to that scholar, because I think it's an important point. I do think that you might see an interesting marginalization of the father's right, despite the biblical evidence. And that same source imply that the identity of the fetus is linked to the mother. Now, it's not the mother's choice. That's still, we will describe as passive. But I think that's an important point, at least, to note. In the situations where we will allow an abortion, the clearest one being where the mom's life is at risk. So who's supposed to do that? I think the mother could beg to do that, but we don't need her to beg. Even she tells us don't do it. The halacha would say that we should do it. The doctor should do it. So then when you get to other cases of, that more rabbinic responsa deal with, like other types of needs or distress or emotional distress, I think the person who's going to initiate that, even halachically, will be the person who asks to do the abortion, which will be the mom, but only in that way. I don't think beyond that. Does that? Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a good observation, but I think overall, if there are grounds for an abortion, I think in reality it will have to gauge through a consultation of the party who's needs an abortion with the rabbinic authority. So that certainly would include the mom. I think rabbinic authorities probably would also speak to the father, etc., and try to get a sense of the home, etc. But that's the way it would come out, not in a more direct assertion of a choice or right than that. I don't think. Right. Okay. So then I think an authority would be sympathetic to some. Again, I don't want to speak too broadly, but I think probably would listen most to the mom. I do think, but again, maybe that I'm not there on the ground, so it could be to try to gauge for the whole family. It's an important point. Maybe two last questions, and then you're free to ask me afterwards. Yes, Dr. Quinn.
Is there a difference between miscarriage and abortion? A lot of the early citations have to do with involuntary loss, or pushing, or this or that.
Yeah.
Whereas the more modern ones talk about abortion, which is involuntary act
Yeah.
terminating of live fetus.
Right.
The others are sort of almost like accidental.
Right. It's a good question. Some of these sources are more accidental, and the question, what about deliberate aborting of a fetus? There are some sources, like that Mishnah about a late-stage pregnancy that it's getting complicated. That's an abortion. That's going in and cutting up the fetus. And there's a Talmudic source I skipped on, source 8, where the Talmud talks about actually actively killing a fetus in a certain situation. So there are some rabbinic sources that speak directly to that. But you're right, some of the sources don't speak directly, and in theory we can make a distinction, but I think the sources align enough that I don't think it's necessary to make that distinction. Okay, Romy and then Michael.
So most of the circumstances that we talked about today are when the mother's life is at risk,
Yeah,
which seems to come down to source 7.
yeah,
But the language used is pretty vague. Ha'isha shehi machsha le'lad.
yeah,
Who's having trouble. Anife shechaya, tovi shechaya.
yeah,
Her life comes before its life.
right.
Is that universally translated by Orthodox rabbis as the woman's life is at risk, or is that the source where distress, for example?
I think they think it. Oh, that's a good question. Right. If you just had Makshal Leiled, we'd leave it at that. But then the continuation, because her life comes before the baby's life. That's where it sounds like a life's at risk.
And people don't define that, for example, as quality.
Oh, I hear you. There are again. I think this modern Orthodox world. My sense is that certainly early on and even later on in a pregnancy, if there was need, there would have to be need, and it would be weighed, but it would be weighed seriously. So I think there is an expanding beyond the life of the mom being at risk in a very just biological sense. But do they do it out of that source? I'm not sure. I think it's out of the sum of the sources. Michael, and then I think ask me afterwards, please. But yeah.
Since we've been talking for good reason, strictly in reference to the mother.
Yeah.
What if the mother decides to go ahead with birth,
Yeah.
knowing that the child has Tay-Sachs or Down syndrome,
Yeah.
and the husband objects?
Yeah.
Can the husband get a divorce?
Wow, I'm definitely going to duck that question. I think we got to wrap. But feel it's a hard question. But I sort of doubt that he could just disappear. But I'll have to think about that one more. What's the cue? Okay. So thank you very much. Let's keep learning together in 3 weeks. And if you have more questions, I'm sticking around.